And we are, that is really hot. All right. We are recording. Welcome to, and we are recording.
Why did you have to say it again? Did you not actually hit record?
Welcome to Shat on TV Lovecraft Country, the unofficial podcast companion piece of the hit HBO series Lovecraft Country. I am one of your hosts, Gene Lyons, and alongside me is my co-host, Ash Lafley.
Hi, y'all.
And this is our deep dive edition where we look back on this week's episode of Lovecraft Country and provide our thoughts and analysis, plus the top listener email and voicemail for the week. This week's episode was episode 9, Rewind 1921. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast to make sure you don't miss an episode. You can do that wherever you get your podcast or by visiting shatontv.com/subscribe. And we have one more instant reaction live stream left that's coming up on Sunday night on Twitch. Thank you, everybody who's joined us there. You can find it immediately after Lovecraft Country airs this Sunday at shatontv.com/Twitch. Now, Ash, this week, it seemed to be a little bit of a party. I think people feel us coming into the home stretch there. Lots of thoughts on this episode, reflecting back on 1921 and the Tulsa Massacre. And I was wondering what your big takeaway was from this episode.
It didn't feel like a penultimate episode of a season, which I thought was a really interesting and bold choice. And the more that I think about it and upon rewatch, I actually really like it because I think it would have cheapened the story they were telling if this had been a rush to kind of get everything in before the end. They let this episode breathe and us explore a really dark and tumultuous moment in American history that I think a lot of people don't know about that are white. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but a lot of people who look like me and that didn't watch Watchmen, I think that this was something that, was really powerful. And I will say, I mean, things continued to fit together. I talked about that last week, and that was really nice to see. And I did like that we picked up where we left off last week, that there wasn't some big time jump and there wasn't some big space in between. But there does seem to be an end game brewing, but I like that we didn't get to that end game this episode. It was a shorter episode, and I really enjoyed it. And I'm looking forward to seeing after this episode how all of those final pieces are going to kind of fit together.
Unlike most penultimate episodes that are wrapping everything up for the finale, this really, to me, felt like Lovecraft Country's own statement on its identity. The showrunners from the beginning have said that they weren't trying to answer the question, what kind of show is this? Like, is it a horror show? Is it a sci-fi show? Is it a drama? And they really wanted to answer instead, what can a TV show be? Like, let's try some combinations that haven't been tried before and do something totally different. And now I'm starting to see, after 9 episodes, that there is a consistency. There is a certain language to Lovecraft Country. I'm not quite fluent in that language, but I can get by. I'm starting to understand how they're presenting things, what this show is. And some of the things that we're finding in every episode that we find in this episode, kind of the hallmarks of Lovecraft Country, are examinations of being othered. There's always specific language. I mean, they're very intentional about the words that they use. There's always irreverence mixed with a sort of melodrama that you and I are no strangers to. And that doesn't make a show bad. I don't mean that in an insulting way, because we love Buffy, and Buffy is incredibly melodramatic. Also, there's homages to pop culture. There's always over the top special effects. And then, of course, I think the biggest thing is there are always lessons in history. Sometimes they're shoehorned in. Sometimes they are rolled out in front of you, but they're present in every episode. Not one goes by where they don't tell us something about American history.
I mean, certainly this week, I think we got our biggest and most intentional history lesson. The series kind of began with the Safe Negro Travel Guide, right? Like it began with that and what the Green Book was. It transitioned from that into us looking into all of these very powerful, famous, important Black cultural figures and heroes. We've explored the otherness, like you said. We looked at Emmett Till last week. And then this week was basically a classroom session on the Tulsa Massacre. And I'm pretty excited to get to talk about this tonight. And excited sounds off when we're talking about something like this, but I truly do mean excited, because anytime I think that a television show or a piece of media can bring knowledge to a group of people, I just still think it's amazing that I grew up. I consider myself to be an incredibly educated person. I have multiple degrees. I did all the things that you're supposed to do in terms of like education and went through a great school system. And the fact that I somehow was never taught about this and like had to learn about it in my 30s, I think is such a travesty. And so I'm excited anytime we can prevent that from happening or pass along knowledge. I think is so important, especially to those of us that are descendant from the people who created such horrors. I think that it's so important for us to recognize our own past. And so I think this is a great opportunity tonight to talk about the Tulsa Massacre and to talk about the importance and kind of the beauty, the operatic nature that this brought to this episode of Lovecraft Country.
And before we get started on the Tulsa Massacre, just as a caveat to the listeners out there, we are not historians. We're two podcasters who have a community that we interact with, and we love interacting with you. And we're bringing our own experiences, our own thoughts on TV, but we are amateurs at best when it comes to history.
Well, and I think a lot of people, I was watching message boards, a lot of people thought some of the scenes in this were kind of ridiculous, not realizing that it's actually like the airplanes and stuff like that are things that actually happened. And I'll just add a caveat to your caveat, the same one that we gave to Emmett Till, which is that we could spend an entire series on the Tulsa Massacre and breaking it down. Please understand that this is, condensed for the sake of the podcast. So we're doing this in a condensed fashion. We may not hit everything, but with that in mind, so 1921, where this episode, where they jump in the portal back to, 1921 is the year that the Tulsa Massacre took place. And it's a part, like we said, of U.S. history that so many people that, especially those people that are white, that just really don't know anything about. So we're looking at May 31st through June 1st of 1921 is actually the time frame. It was an overnight and day period when the Tulsa Massacre took place. And much like Emmett Till, how we explored last week, much like that, this all began with an accusation that a white woman made against a Black individual. This time, the white woman was 17-year-old Sarah Page, who was an elevator worker, like back in the day where they used to have the person that had to move the handle to move you up and move you down. And there was a Black shoe shiner. His name was Dick Rowland, and he was accused of assaulting Page, and he was arrested. So the rumor began to circulate throughout Tulsa that Rowland was going to be lynched for this accusation, that he wasn't going to have any sort of say, that they weren't going to really investigate. They were just going to assume his guilt and they were going to lynch him. And so approximately 75 Black men came to the jail to try to prevent this lynching from happening, that they rightfully so thought was a horrendous thing and would have been, a murder of this young man. The sheriff, and that sheriff was white, of course, he assured the men that there would be no lynching. He said, please, go away. We're not going to lynch him. And these other white men, of course, came up and, saw these Black men there and were like, oh, we're going to help the sheriff. We're going to help stop it. And so there was a tussle that happened where a white man tried to disarm one of the Black men that was there. Because, guys, at this time, everybody carried weapons. Like, this was just a part of the 1920s. It was still a part of culture. Look at what happened in this episode when they opened that drawer and there's like 50 handguns in there. Like, weapons were something that people walked around with and that they still had. And so this white man took it upon himself to try to disarm a Black man who was peacefully standing there. And somehow a shot was fired. It's believed that it was an accident, that somehow that shot got fired. But of course, all hell hell broke loose once that shot was fired. A firefight ensued. And by the time that one firefight, not the massacre, but that one firefight ended, there were 12 people dead. There were 10 white men dead and 2 black men that were dead. And because those 10 white men died, the white portion of the city took it upon themselves to take it out on the rest of the city. And this is what sparked the violence that we begin to see in this episode that in real life was the Tulsa Massacre.
And Ash, you spoke to how the scope of the violence and the destruction seems unbelievable by American standards. I mean, this is something that happened on American soil. It's something you think that you would hear about. And somebody watching Lovecraft Country or watching Watchmen might look at this and go, this seems a little too idyllic. And then it seems like a little too far-fetched that there would be this much destruction. There's a lot more at work than just this attempted lynching, right? That there is a tension there because this is essentially a bastion of Black success in the 1920s.
Well, and one thing that sounds absolutely ridiculous, but unfortunately is true, is that once all of the violence erupted across the city of Tulsa actually deputized mobs of these white men, and they gave them weapons, and they said, go out and handle it. They basically agreed with and sanctioned what occurred after this firefight. And so these rioters that were white, these criminals that were white, went through these Black neighborhoods. And you mentioned Black Wall Street. So it was 25 square blocks of a district that was called Black Wall Street that eventually was destroyed. It was burned down. The white people looted in that area and they killed multiple Black residents. And it was destroyed. Those 25 square blocks were literally destroyed. It looked like a war zone. And when you see those like crop planes, that's what they used. They were personal planes that people put up in the air, dropping ammunition. And it looks insane. But this is something that really occurred.
And in that scene of destruction, we see Montrose in this very haunting scene where he's looking out through the window and he's watching the city burn. And remember, for Montrose, this is a tougher experience than for anyone else in this episode because he's seen this before. You know, asking someone to time travel is one thing, risking their life, going through this mysterious portal. But you're asking Montrose to go back to probably the worst time in his entire life and relive that. And so you see that Michael K. Williams pulls that off beautifully. But he mentions some names in this scene. He mentions Commodore Knox. Commodore Knox was the final recorded death of the massacre. He's just a young Black man. A.C. Jackson, he talks about that doctor who was shot in the face. This was not a person who was a combatant. A.C. Jackson was a doctor, a man of peace. He specialized in chronic illnesses and women's health. This guy invented medical procedures and invented medical tools. He walked out. He was attempting to surrender. He had his hands up. By all accounts, he was shot in the face. And then again, when he was on the ground, he was shot again while trying to surrender himself. There was no quarter for people in this massacre. That's why it's a massacre. And another name that's thrown out by Montrose is Pegleg Taylor. Now, this figure, Pegleg Taylor, was associated with the Battle of Standpipe Hill. This was a defense of the city by Black residents against white aggressors, essentially. And Pegleg was one of those defenders. Now, the Tulsa Star, the newspaper, did some research into it. And Pegleg did not defend the hill on his own, as some stories might say. But his story is fascinating and tragic in itself. He worked in cotton fields, and one day he got his pay. He was ready to go home, and he was told to keep working. He was a teenager at the time until it was too dark to see. And he was like, no, I'm done. I got my pay. I'm going home. As he attempted to leave those cotton fields, he was beaten by a white mob. He was left on train tracks to get run over and die. Now, Pegleg managed to crawl his way off the tracks, but he was hit by the train, and the impact severed his leg and shot him basically across the field. And he landed in some brush where he was bleeding out. Now, luckily, 2 white women found him. They stopped the bleeding, but he did lose the leg. Regardless, he did defend Standpipe Hill, and he did survive, actually. He ended up moving to Phoenix, Arizona, oddly, where he died in his 70s. Another part of that legend is that he used a machine gun to defend the hill. And in fact, that's not the case. The National Guard had a machine gun, and that machine gun was only able to fire like one round at a time because it was kind of just getting destroyed by water and other elements. So there were heroes and there were legends forged in this battle, but mostly it was essentially a brutalization of the Black population of Tulsa.
Well, and we're talking about that brutalization. I mean, looking at numbers, the official records, and I put that in scare quotes, official records, say that 39 people died in the massacre, that 26 were Black, 13 were white, that 800 people were injured, and that 6,000 Black people were arrested. You notice there's no white people in there. 6,000 Black people were arrested. But the 39 people dead is just really considered to be a vast underestimate. The actual number they estimate is closer to being between 150 to 300, but we don't really know. And I think that's one of the biggest travesties of this is that here we are 99 years later, right? Almost 100 years later. And we still don't know the actual number.
If anyone thinks massacre is an overstatement, the Boston Massacre, 5 colonists died. 5. Okay, this is a legitimate massacre. And one of our listeners who goes by Professor hit me up on Discord, which, by the way, if you haven't checked out our Discord, it's shatontv.com/Discord. Join us there. You can hang out all week. He linked me to this story about a search happening right now, right as we record this, at a suspected mass gravesite in Tulsa. According to the city of Tulsa and funeral home records and other documents from 1921, they know that at least 18 identified and unidentified Black massacre victims were buried in the city-owned cemetery. And then they have a second test excavation site where they spoke to a man named Clyde Eddy, who was a 10-year-old, roughly the age that, the Montrose would have been in 1921, who witnessed burial of massacre victims at another site. So they've been using radar sort of to ping down into the ground and see what else is in there. And they found what they believe to be the walls of another mass burial site. So Ash, as you were saying, it's highly likely that the number dead is closer in the range of more than 100.
Well, and if the human capital wasn't horrific enough, like the actual capital also was a huge loss that has had far-reaching consequences on the Black population of Tulsa. So there was $1.5 million in real estate that was damaged as a result of this, and $750,000 in personal property damage. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but if you transition that, if you think about with inflation, that $750,000 in personal property damage today would be $32.5 million. It's a significant amount of money, and nobody was compensated for their losses at all.
Yeah, some of the beautiful scenery you saw, which, by the way, HBO did a wonderful job recreating this 1921 Tulsa. But you see that Dreamland Theater. You see other parts of Black Wall Street, as you mentioned, Ash, this 25 blocks of gorgeous neighborhoods. As you said, there was no compensation for the destruction there. The Dreamland Theater, Black families, they couldn't get the insurance to pay for their ruined properties because Tulsa was recorded as a riot. Earlier this season, a listener wrote in and said, watch the words you use, call it a massacre, not a riot. And this is why words matter, guys, is because in this sense, a riot implies that the people occupying the space are the ones destroying the space, right? And in this sense, this was a massacre. This was an attack on neighborhoods, not people destroying their own neighborhood. Insurance didn't pay out. $32.5 million, as you said, Ash, in today's dollars, just up in smoke.
Well, and I said that it's had far-reaching consequences in terms of that loss of capital in the Black population of Tulsa, and there's a reason for that. So before I started working at the university, I ran the family services and homeowner services department of a Habitat affiliate here in Houston, a Habitat for Humanity affiliate. And the reason why Habitat for Humanity exists is because statistically, research-based evidence shows the number one way to break generational poverty is through homeownership. Homeownership and the owning of property is a huge way to both build capital, to gain financial stability, and to break those cycles of generational poverty. And this area that they burned down, these were all homes that were owned by Black families. This was property that Black families owned that would have been passed down generationally, and that couldn't happen anymore. They didn't just take their home away. They took away so much more in terms of the ability of these families to grow and expand and maintain and gain wealth at the same rate of their white counterparts that also own property and homes. These disparities exist in our society for a lot of reasons, but a lot of our disparity between our different socioeconomic groups and specifically between Blacks and whites, especially in the South, center around education and around property and the owning of property and the generational lack of property ownership and transferring of it. And there's a lot of reasons why that has been denied. There's a lot of racist policies that have enabled that denial to continue, but also it's examples like this. It's these horrible moments where huge swaths of white criminals, white racists came through and burned down and took this property away that was not replaced. And today we don't have mass mobs doing it. We have hurricanes and things like that that are going through and doing it and affecting in an unequal way. But we have to consider that it isn't just the loss of life. This loss of capital has had such a detrimental and generational effect that is still being felt in Black pockets of Tulsa today. And if you combine that with what is probably one of the worst parts about this, which is that both Blacks and whites kept this silent for decades, those that stayed in Tulsa, they didn't talk about it, the Black families because they were afraid, rightfully so, and the white families because I don't know, they're bad people, because they're ashamed, because they're cowards. We could list out tons of reasons, but they didn't talk about it. And so that's why this massacre in some ways is unknown, but it's also systematically been removed from the local histories of Tulsa as well as our national history. This is something that should be taught along with, I think about the night of shattered glass that we all learn about when learning about the Holocaust, right? Like that's such a huge moment. Like this is in American history, the night of shattered glass.
And instead of shattered glass, Ash, in this scene, we had fire. It was a very powerful motif throughout the episode. And really, as the city of Tulsa began to burn, we found ourselves in another one of these very intentional voiceovers from HBO and Lovecraft Country.
And we wanted to kind of delve into this. So the voiceover we hear this week is from Sonia Sanchez, who, if you don't know who Sonia Sanchez is, go check out her works, her writings, her poetry. She's absolutely incredible, absolutely amazing. And this comes from a poem that she published as a part of a collection in 1995. And the poem is called Catch the Fire. I want to read, we don't do this often, but it's so powerful with this imagery here. We just wanted to read the excerpt because this is actually a very long poem. This is just a tiny, tiny excerpt. But the part that she reads is, "Where is your fire? I say, where is your fire? Can't you smell it coming out of our past? The fire of living, not dying. The fire of loving, not killing. The fire of blackness, not gangster shadows. Where is our beautiful fire that gave light to the world? The fire of pyramids, the fire that burned through the hulls of slave ships and made us breathe." And I was so moved by the juxtaposition of this poem and her talking about a different type of fire, right? Like the fire that burns within, the fire of specifically what she's talking about here, Black activism, and it being a fire that should be caught by all people that are Black, that we can never, as a society, and especially those that are Black, can never forget the sins of the past and the effects that slavery had then all the way through to now in modern times. And this poem is such a call to that activism. And so we're watching one of the examples of what she's talking about, which is literal fire burning down Black Wall Street in Tulsa in 1921, while taking this positive lens of saying this type of fire we need to catch to keep our people and our history and ourselves alive. And it's this really beautiful combination of activism in light of these horrific moments, but still a beautiful way to think about the history of Blackness, the experience of Blackness, that it is forged in fires that were set and that burn so much of their past, but it sets a fire to allow for them to be proud to be Black, and for the Black experience and the Black people to take this and move themselves forward to keep fighting for equity, not for equality. And somebody hit me up on social media because I said that on a different podcast or on Twitch Live, whatever. And they're like, equity and equality is the same thing. Well, newsflash, guys, equity and equality are not the same thing. They have nothing to do with each other. Equality is what was given to the Black race with the civil rights movement, and it didn't do shit because equality doesn't cancel out inequalities in the past. Equality is not the opposite of inequality. Equity is the opposite of inequality. Equity is the answer to stopping oppression. And I think this is a beautiful poem to remind all of us watching about that. And just a really perfect voiceover. We've had some great ones. I personally think this, along with James Baldwin and the first one, have been certainly the most successful.
Baldwin reduced me to tears. I mean, that was the most powerful one, and I'm glad they used it in episode 1. But this was also very powerful coming from Sonia Sanchez. For me, the moment in this episode that really shook me up was this interaction between Letitia and Hattie, who's played by Regina Taylor, where Hattie kind of reaches down to Letitia's, pregnancy and basically says, "This is my faith made flesh." I'm so glad that Lovecraft Country came along at this point in my life, because I wouldn't have understood this as a young man. Now, as I get older, I increasingly understand the power in procreation, the power in a future generation. And that's really amplified when you're an oppressed people. Because at some point in your life, you understand that things are not going to change on a timeline that matches your life. And think about the pain of that and the situation that puts you in. Hattie knows that during her lifetime, especially as the city is burning down around her, she knows that during my lifetime, there will be no equality. There will be no equity. There will be no breaking of these shackles. Like, this is it for me. Even if I live another 20 years, this is all there will ever be. And so you have to look forward to future generations to make manifest the world that you hope for. Watching that moment again, yes, the melting was a bit much, but they can't help themselves with the special effects budget. But the point there being that there was a powerful moment of legacy, of looking forward to your future and saying, you know what, maybe not for me, maybe not for my child, but maybe for my child's child, there will be a world that's worth me dying for. And at the end of the episode, Sonia Sanchez's words are brought forth again, this time as part of an opera. And I was very curious about this, why the decision was made, because this is something we haven't seen before in Lovecraft Country, was sort of a musical representation of the spoken word that was presented earlier. And according to the LA Times, the composer for Lovecraft Country, Laura Karpman, she collaborates on the score. She decided to write a requiem for this part of the episode. So she met with Misha Green and talking about how this relates to our lives today, and the fact that this show is being made during a very tumultuous time, as you mentioned, Ash, for America. This moment where Misha Green and Laura Karpman came together, this was in the wake of George Floyd's death and the protests that followed. So they were writing the music for this scene, and it took on a sort of a different life, a certain contemporary relevance in all of it. I think that shows like this and shows like Watchmen was almost like a precursor to what we never expected to happen in our country. And now it seems like Lovecraft Country is sort of a realization that, history does repeat itself in effect, or that we have not escaped what we considered our past.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what it is. I think it's not necessarily that history repeats itself as much as it is that history is the present, that nothing actually changed. I think that that's what we take away. What does Lovecraft mean to me? Like, what's the theme of Lovecraft to somebody like me with my experience watching it? I think it's the importance of understanding that what we're seeing on screen, the monsters, the monster of racism that we don't have Jim Crow anymore, but we have lots of other things that maintain the same systems. The same way Jim Crow upheld slavery, we have the same systems today that uphold Jim Crow and slavery. And I think that what a horrifying, I mean, it's the month of horror, right? Like Shocktober. What is more shocking and horrifying than that realization? And what's more of a call to action for all of us than to reconcile our own selves with our past and to try to change what it looks like moving forward?
Well, pivoting from history to TV, just straight up TV, I want to talk about some of the things that we saw in this episode that were callbacks to earlier in the season. Really smart callbacks, actually, in a lot of ways. And Ash, you mentioned this being a penultimate episode. I'm glad to see that a lot of these storylines, a lot of these metaphors, a lot of the mythology of Lovecraft Country kind of came full circle. Starting with Tulsa, Leti and the fire, there was this imagery of Leti walking through the fire in the middle of the street in Tulsa, knowing that she is invulnerable. At least what I saw was imagery that was mirroring Hannah walking from Artem, with the Book of Names the first time. Now Leti is walking with the Book of Names for a second time. And then again, that is echoed in Leti and Tick's burning in their respective dreams. I will say that a lot of listeners, including on Lovecraft Country Live, pointed out that she walked very, very slowly. I think it was to demonstrate the power of her invulnerability and also just for dramatic effect. As for Tick, we find out in this episode that he is that mysterious stranger who rescued his father, another very strong callback that kind of permeates throughout the season. Montrose, during the Tulsa Massacre, he said that he was basically on death's door, but then this stranger came in and was smashing heads like Jackie Robinson swinging a bat. And then we see this is actually Tick. If you remember, going all the way back to episode 1, when King Bee broke down that dream that Tick was having, the Martians and the war scene going on, you had Jackie Robinson show up and he said those words, "I got your back, kid." And we see here the origins of that. It's very Back to the Future.
What's going to be really fun about this show is being able to go back and rewatch that opening that we all thought was so weird and strange, and almost watching it like an overture, right? Like you do like in a musical, how you hear all the music and the overture before you actually see the musical. I think it's very much an overture, which I think is kind of neat. And I want to go back and look for Easter eggs all throughout it.
Now, one Easter egg that I absolutely whiffed on was thinking that the voiceover that we saw at the beginning of an episode with Montrose was Montrose abusing Tick. And listeners were very quick to hop up and say, nope, Gene, actually, we believe that was Montrose hearing his own father, who was beating him for being effeminate, talking about putting a flower in his hair and, preening in front of a mirror. And we get confirmation in this episode that the voiceover that we heard was, in fact, Montrose's father speaking to him to pick out a switch and to be beaten. Again, speaking to that legacy of intergenerational violence. And speaking of Montrose, I think one of the most beautiful, poignant points of this episode, I would say the pinnacle of this episode for me personally, was this look at what Montrose's struggle really is. Now, Montrose as a character, you imagine he's got lots of struggles, right? He's a Black man. He survived the Tulsa Massacre. He's gay. Also, he has apparently a drinking problem. But his real struggle is, in fact, fatherhood. He says to Tick that the experience of the Tulsa Massacre was just the first in a long list of sacrifices he had to make to be Tick's father. And I mentioned this on Lovecraft Live, that this, Ash, was something that I did not even contemplate prior to this episode. And again, that constant education that Lovecraft Country gives us, you had to make a decision prior to the gay rights movement, the modern gay rights movement. Do you want to be a parent or do you want to be gay, essentially? Because you could not be both. For Montrose, his primary drive was fatherhood above all else. Another parent that we see is Hippolyta, who makes a triumphant and really awesome return in this episode. We'll get to that a bit in the voicemail as well. But, I really appreciated her coming back, tying this all back together with the I Am episode and being this catalyst for action in the episode. And in this episode, we see that she does take on that blue hair as a result of being plugged in as the motherboard for the portal. That blue hair does match Diana's comic book character, Orthia Blue, who is based on Hippolyta. So I thought that was a really, really cool tie back. And then we get the reference to Tick's death. This part was super intriguing because we know that Tick is predicted to die, right? So Gia has seen it. Tick has read the book, the Lovecraft Country, novel. And apparently he's sort of getting cozy with the idea of this fatalistic approach to death, that he's going to get strapped in some sort of ritual during the autumnal equinox. And I hate saying it, and I hate that everyone on the show says it. Let's just call it the equinox. But Leti seems to be fighting against this fatalistic view of things. And it'll be interesting to see where that takes us as a show. As we get into this final episode, I think those questions will all be answered. Another question that was answered in this episode was about Lancaster's torso. Some people thought it was a bunch of tattoos. Other people thought that it was sort of a black man's torso. Here we see that he is being rejuvenated, or at least regenerated, by sewing on, very crudely, Frankenstein style, a black torso to sort of keep him alive, which makes his entire character as the police captain in Chicago all the more gruesome. And speaking of death, we finally also get to Uncle George's death. Now, when Uncle George died, a lot of us were kind of in shock. We didn't believe it. And most of the time, that's what deaths are for on HBO, right? You think of Game of Thrones. Death is just there to shock us or to generate buzz on social media, right? This was a weird one because in this case, our hearts were with George already. We really liked him as this kind of bookish, very sweet man in very cool sweaters. And then he died and we couldn't believe it. And then we had weeks to grieve him. And then we actually got to meet George in this episode. We got to see him as a boy and also learn how important he was to everyone around him. It was bittersweet and almost a reverse introduction to the character. Now, before we get to the letters and voicemail for the episode, I did want to point out one other thing, just a trivial thing maybe, but it was something that caught my attention because it's a history that I'm well acquainted with. It's the concept of a Pullman porter. So if you go back in this episode, you notice there's a reference to Pullman porters. And if you don't know what that is, these were men who were hired to work on the railroads as porters. So these were the people who would kind of be the service on the railroads, particularly in sleeping cars, right? So you had, affluent people who were traveling the country, or even semi-affluent people traveling the country, and they would sleep in these sleeping cars. Starting shortly after the Civil War, a man named George Pullman, he would go out and seek out former slaves and offer them work on his sleeper cars. So they would carry their baggage, they would shine their shoes, set up the beds and maintain their rooms, drinks and food and everything else to the passengers. So they're basically what you think of as hotel service, but on these sleeping cars. Now, interesting facts about these guys is one is they all had to answer to George, the commonplace, term that they would use for all of these men. Doesn't sound like that glamorous a job. And by no means do I think this was an honor to do. But for Black Americans at the time, this did some pretty important things for the community. One is it allowed these often young Black men to travel around the country in ways that they wouldn't be able to do normally. Two is it exposed them to these elites, right? They were essentially speaking with, interacting with, presenting themselves in front of white people who had money, who had status, and they could learn a lot from them and also teach them a lot. And then perhaps most importantly, they also went to bigger cities and brought back news and culture and even newspapers from big cities like Chicago, like Philadelphia, and were able to bring that back into their community. So the Pullman porter job, although not glamorous, was very essential position of status among the Black community at the time. And I thought it was a cool reference that they brought up in this episode.
I didn't know about that. I actually think that's really amazing. That's why I love this podcast, Gene. You teach me something.
We teach each other, Ash. We teach each other. All right. Now it's time for the voicemail and email. We have 2 voicemails this week, and the first comes from Miss T.
Hello. My name is Miss T, and I just got done watching Lovecraft, episode 9, and I was wondering what you all thought about the pacing of the show itself and this episode. I really feel like some things deserved more than a quick conversation. When Hippolyta just appeared out of nowhere, she did explain that she had been gone, but they should have gotten more into depth and learned more about it. When Montrose confessed that he may not be Tick's father, they gave that, which was a huge situation, really a quick answer, period. So I'm wondering, why is it that they're doing this? In the beginning half of this season, it was slightly slower than this in the last half. Do you think that that's stopping them from telling a truly good story because they don't flush out and resolve things for us as the audience? They do tell us reasons, but they really don't give us a lot of time to process some of these things. Everything moves so fast. And my last thing, this group, biggest problem is communication. If they would start communicating with each other, Christina would have no power over them. But because everybody wants to be a chief and nobody wants to be an Indian, they are putting themselves at risk and danger. How did Leti not tell Tick that she gave the papers of the book? How did he not tell her what he did with Christina? How does Leti's sister just get to randomly say something and nobody asked? Ruby was the only person that had a conversation with her sister. So when her sister brings up going to ask Christina and she'll do it, that to me should have had a huge conversation. She talked to her sister about it, but she never told Tick. That was the first time he had heard of it. She never told Montrose. That was the first time he heard of it. So why didn't they make her explain that more? Why were they just like, oh, okay, she's going to do it for you? Great.
One of my biggest criticisms has been, I feel like the pacing has been weird throughout the show. I will stand by my opinion about this particular episode, and I think that this episode was purposeful in the way that it paced itself and spent the time it did in Tulsa, and I'm glad it did. I think it made us all better people and better viewers because of it. But I do agree there's some, it seems strange. There's some things that they're choosing to spend a lot of exposition and a lot of explanation on. And there's other things that they're just kind of like throwing in there and not really taking a lot of time to talk about the effects or consequences of those items. So I think that's a good criticism, and I'm hoping it all pays off next week.
And I agree with you, Miss T, about the communication thing. It's a wonder that nobody's asking follow-up questions on this show. It's just kind of like as you said, and oh, okay. That's kind of how it goes. But again, there is a massive amount of content they're trying to fit into 10 episodes. And so I think that's just the whirlwind nature of it. And Ash, I'll admit, I've said it before, I'm 40 years old, and maybe this is just TV for a generation that I don't quite understand. Thanks to Miss T for calling in. Next up, we have one from Tawana, who's one of our first callers ever, and we're so glad she called back.
Hi, guys. It's Tawana Tanik, last one for this week, I swear. But, I've just been sitting here thinking about, the comments that you have no right to review the podcast because you're not Black, because it's probably just for people of color. And, the more I think about it, actually, the more incensed I get that actually was suggested. And I don't watch the Twitch. I don't know what it is. I don't watch the Twitch. So, have no idea what was said on that. But, that type of attitude takes us nowhere. So can people of color not objectively review anything that was made by Caucasian people, not objectively review anything that was made by Asian people? Like, what are we saying? When does this end, right? When can we only comment on things that were made for, we think, people like us? And where does that take us, and where does that leave us? And I guess I'm getting more and more incensed as I think about it, because one of the reasons why I'm so behind on my watching is that we've just had an election here in my country, in Bermuda. last week, Thursday. Thank goodness our leaders acquitted themselves slightly better than the options you're facing. But, for that election, one of my roles was to provide commentary, election night coverage. And we had, as the neutral and the facilitator, we had discussions from Parliament and cabinet ministers on either side of the House of Assembly. And, for anybody to have a productive dialogue, for me to think what I think, not being a political body, for them to be able to actively talk about each other and each other's politics, and maybe not each other, but certainly each other's politics and parties. If we were saying that you can only speak about what's in your experience, particularly because that was a white cabinet minister and a black cabinet minister whose experiences are vastly different. But to say you cannot comment on where you think the issues are, what you think could be done better, I rid us that lead us in the end, right? And it's just, honestly, the more I think about it, the more incensed I get, because I'm like, okay, right, so then maybe I can never read, I don't know, A Midsummer's Night's Dream, right? I can read it, but I certainly can't criticize, I don't know, Shakespeare's use of iambic pentameter or whatever it is, right? So, it's really, where does this lead us? Anyway, like I said before, and my voice notes before, I know they're rambling, and really at this point, I feel like it's a conversation between you and I, and you play them, you don't. But yeah, no, so keep doing what you're doing. Long story short, too late, I know, but keep doing what you're doing.
Well, Tawana, I appreciate you, calling in. And I think that I've come to peace with this notion of not being able to necessarily comment entirely on art that I don't necessarily understand completely, right? And so I think a part of it is, and I don't mean to equate by any means the Black experience in America with like the Iranian experience in America, but I know that if there was a show made for Iranian Americans, like Shaws of Sunset, if Ash and I watch it, she might think it's funny, but I might think it's a lot funnier because I grew up in it. And so I think that's kind of the comment that people are making, and they may not be making it as eloquently as you might, Tawana, but I think there's no reason to be incensed. It's just sort of the notion that, hey, listen, we're trying to enjoy something over here. Could you, stop nitpicking at what's going on? Or maybe like, hey, Gene, you don't love this as much as I do because it's not what you've lived. I respect that opinion. Honestly, the more and more I think about it, the more and more comfortable I am with it. Now, if someone said you're not allowed to talk about the show at all, I think that's very different. But you know what? No one wrote in to say that. All they were saying is maybe I won't listen to this podcast anymore. And that's okay. I think the one time that we got genuinely upset is when there was accusations, I think, of bigotry, of racism. That was the part that I was like, no, if there's clunky exposition in the show, which I think in this episode there was, even though we appreciated it, we have listeners of color like Black Nerd who are like, yeah, it was clunky as shit. That's okay to say. So thank you so much for calling in, Tawana, and we hope that you'll stick around for the last episode. Love to hear from you again. Ash, I think it's time for some email.
All right, so the first one we actually addressed on, and by we, I mean you, addressed on Shappy Hour, and it's by Misha. Hey, y'all. I wanted to say I'm enjoying the podcast and the Twitch streams. This is definitely the type of show that needs to be discussed, and I thank you for doing this because I don't know many people in real life who watch this. With that said, any thoughts on why the writers are including so many first times for Christina? So far, we've been presented with 3 times she says this. Birthing the monster baby from a cow, episode 2. Playing hide and seek, episode 4. Being killed like Emmett Till, episode 8. Thanks for reading, and can't wait to hear if anyone has any insight on my question because it definitely has me scratching my head. Best regards, Misha. And I thought this one was actually really interesting, this whole idea of first. I hadn't noticed that theme, but I think that you're correct. And when we're talking about like the metamorphosis and the fact that each time it's something new, I think that this very much could be a theme that's being addressed over and over again with this idea that Christina has all these firsts because she's becoming something maybe even she doesn't know. Because she mentions this week, it's very Buffy. She talks about her ascension. And if you're a Buffy fan, You're getting major season 3 vibes here with the ascension. And so maybe that all connects.
Misha, when I was watching episode 9, I had a moment like Rick Dalton in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. You know, the meme of like Leonardo DiCaprio pointing at the TV screen. I was like, oh, because Christina literally says an eternity of first. And I was like, Misha's email. We had to bring it back. We have to talk about it. She's explaining flat out that her father and people like him looked at magic as another form of power, like politics or money or anything else, and that she wanted to experience magic. And so if you look back at all the things that she's doing, birthing the monster baby from the cow, playing hide and seek, experiencing death, these are all ways that she experiences magic, or her view of magic, right? This metaphysical experience of life. I have a much more cynical view of that, in the sense that I don't think that what she sees as magic is magical, but rather it is magical to her. And I thought it was so fascinating that you picked that up, just before this episode was released. So I think the writers are speaking your language, Misha.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Misha, for writing in. The next one comes from ML, and it is entitled, Thank You. Hey, y'all. I've been a listener to your TV podcast for Game of Thrones and Westworld. So when I began watching Lovecraft Country and quickly realized there are messages and Easter eggs I knew I was missing, I quickly looked into a companion podcast, hoping you guys would do one, and I was pleasantly surprised. As a 35-year-old Black man, I was a little worried about how your podcast would discuss race and identity regarding the show, but just like other sensitive topics that have come up in television shows you all have done, you've handled the topics well. I'm actually very disappointed that you've gotten messages from people calling you racist. You've acknowledged your privilege, accepted that some of the messages in the show aren't for you, kept an open mind, accepted constructive criticism, and asked important questions. I'm not really sure what more you can do. Anyway, I really hope you guys finish out this season and come back for a second one if there is one. Even as a pretty well-read, educated African American, I've learned a few historical facts from your podcast I hadn't got a chance to look up for myself that the show introduced. P.S. Ashley, through most of Westworld podcasts, I couldn't stand your opinions. Woo! Then one day you came out and said something to the effect of, maybe I'm just reading too much into this show. I've been rocking with you ever since. Keep up the great work, ML. Let me just say, Westworld, we should have been able to read that much into it. Westworld season 3 was a big change, right? Like Gene and I both way overanalyzed Westworld 3 because we didn't realize that it was becoming the show that it became in season 3. But I'm so glad that I was able to say something that got you, on my side. And we very much appreciate you sticking around for this one. We really do. All right, so the next one comes from longtime writer Susan from State College, and she says, hello, Ash and Jean. So Leti is invulnerable, Tick has a pet Shoggoth, and Hippolyta has mastered time and space. As the gamers might say, these are some very OP characters. But will they be able to use any of that against Christina? I had to go back and check the beginning of the episode in case I was mistaken, and I don't think I am. Here is how I interpreted the opening scene with Christina and the family. Christina tells them that she would need Lancaster to break the curse. Well, Lancaster is dead. Oh, really? How unfortunate. The best she can offer then is a reset to buy time for Diana. After making a deal to help Dee if Tick goes back with her to Artem, Christina as William visits Lancaster's office. Does she do anything to get Lancaster to break the curse? Nope. She just gloats over Lancaster as he dies. Poor little rich white girl has her own agenda, and she doesn't care how many bodies she has to walk over to get to her goal. I also want to mention that I was sad to see the extremely overused time travel trope to avoid paradoxes. They went back in time because they had to go back in time and become part of the past while having been part of the past. Time travel tip, going into the past to kill your own grandfather won't work. However, going back to save your parents is just determinism. One more episode. Let's see how it all comes together. Stay safe, stay well. Susan from State College.
Susan, first of all, as a gamer who's cool with the kids, I want to say congratulations on using the term OP. That makes you super cool in my book. But also, thank you for breaking down this Lancaster scene, because you revealed a couple things here. I, the dummy that I am, watched this episode and I was like, maybe this Christina, unlike Caleb in the book, maybe this Christina's like kind of all right. Maybe she is trying to help. Maybe she's not so bad. But when you lay it out this way, oh shit, she is bad. She's playing everybody. So she had the opportunity to help. Lancaster's not dead. She knows it. She goes back as William and kills him. But here's the truly nefarious part of it. William says, I had hoped to watch you die 1,000 deaths, but I have to settle for one, meaning that he is actually even denying himself gratification, or Christina is denying herself gratification of watching this man tortured just so she can close off the possibility of helping Diana because it furthers her goals. That is one shitty person. Well, thanks, Susan, for your email, and thanks to everybody who wrote in and called in. Again, if you'd like to email us, it's hosts@shatontv.com or call 914-719-SHAT and leave a voicemail. If you didn't hear your email or voicemail on this episode, there's a very strong chance it'll show up on our Shappy Hour on Friday night. That is our cocktail party live at 9 p.m. Eastern every Friday night. Last week, we did Mai Tais. This week, I want to do something slightly less sugary. So keep an eye on Twitter or on our Discord, and I'll let you know what we're making this week. That concludes this week's episode of Shat on TV Lovecraft Country. We hope you enjoyed, and we'll join us next week for more. Be sure to follow us on social media and share with a friend. We're on Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram at Shat on TV. On Facebook, just search for Shat on TV Podcast. The website is shatontv.com. You can email us, hosts@shatontv.com, or call 914-719-SHAT. Also, you can join us live on Twitch all week at shatontv.com/Twitch. Also, check out our sister podcast, Shat the Movies, where we join our good friend, Big D, Dick Ebert, to cover 80s and 90s movies commissioned by you, the listeners. We are currently in the middle of an Indiana Jones block. It's very exciting. You can find past and future episodes at shatthemovies.com. And if you're looking for a very special Halloween episode, we got you covered. Halloween 4 coming your way this year. Wherever fine podcasts can be found, including iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Pandora, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe. And if you stop by iTunes, please leave a 5-star review that helps the podcast grow. On behalf of my co-hosts, Ash Schlafly, Big D, Dick Ebert, and the King Bee, I'm Gene Lyons. Be sure to join us on Friday night for Shappy Hour, and then Sunday night for the final episode of Lovecraft Country Live on Twitch, shatontv.com/Twitch. Thanks for listening. As always, wear a mask, vote,
and stay the fuck at home.